Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm thrilled to see so many people here. Thank you for coming. And I'm also thrilled to have three extremely distinguished and wonderful scholars. This event is it's going to have kind of two elements to it. This is part a book launch for Paige Reynolds' latest book. And it's also going to be a panel discussion with all three of our guests on 20th century and contemporary Irish women writers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce all of our speakers first, and then Paige and I will talk a little bit about her book, and then we'll move to a sort of panel discussion, and then to audience questions. Okay. So Paige Reynolds is Stephen J. Pryor Professor of Humanities at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester. She's the author of Modernism in Irish Women's Contemporary Writing, The Stubborn Mode, and you see the cover up there on the screen. This is the book that we are celebrating today. She's also the author of Modernism, Drama, and the Audience for Irish Spectacle. She's the editor of Modernist Afterlives in Irish Literature and Culture, The New Irish Studies from 2020, and with Eric Falchi, Irish Literature in Transition, Volume 6, 1980 to 2020, which, yes, I talked her into doing. Most recently, she curated the exhibition Happy Ever After, Falling in Love with Irish Romance Fiction for the Museum of Literature Ireland in Dublin, which, if people don't know about it, it's a lovely museum. It is well worth visiting next time you're in Dublin. The exhibit runs until February 2026 and has been featured in venues including the Irish Independent, the Moncrief Show, and the Irish Times. Kate Costello-Sullivan, to her left, is the current Mary A. Carroll Endowed Professor in Arts and Sciences at Moyne College. And she's also a past president of the American Conference for Irish Studies, which I imagine is not an easy job, so we're all very grateful. She's published widely on 19th, 20th, and 21st century Irish fiction. Her monographs are Mother Country, Politics of the Personal in the Fiction of Colm Tóibín, and Trauma and Recovery in the 21st Century Irish Novel. She has edited critical editions of Sheridan Le Fanu's novella Carmilla and Nora Holt's short story collection Poor Women, and yes, I talked her into doing that. I'm sensing a pattern here. Most recently, Kate co-edited the Routledge History of Irish America with Cian McMahon, another co-edited collection with Derek Hand and Neil Murphy on the contemporary Irish novel is forthcoming in early 2026. And she didn't put this in the bio she sent me, but she was foolish enough to mention that she has an astounding 7 articles forthcoming right now. So I couldn't leave that out, right? Okay, Claire Bracken. To her left is professor in the English department at Union College in New York, where she teaches courses on Irish literature and film. She's published journal articles and book chapters on Irish women's writing, feminist criticism, and 20th and 21st century fiction and poetry, most recently in volumes entitled Irish Shame, that was 2025, the Routledge International Handbook of Irish Studies, 2021, and the New Irish Studies. She's co-editor of Anne Enright and Viewpoints, Theoretical Perspectives on Irish Visual Text. Her book, Irish Feminist Futures, was published by Routledge in 2016 as part of the Transformation series. In 2017, she co-edited with Tara Harney Mahajan a double special issue of the journal LIT entitled Recessionary Imaginings, Post-Celtic Tiger Ireland, and Contemporary Women's Writing. She's also the co-editor with Cara DeLay of the 2021 special issue Reproductive Justice and the Politics of Women's Health in Ireland for the journal Air Ireland. Okay, welcome to all three of you, and I would like to just start us off our discussion of Paige's new book by asking Paige to just tell us briefly about the texts and the issues you analyzed and what the arguments you've made about them.
Well, first off, I want to say thank you all for coming out, and also thank you to Marjorie for putting this together. We were talking earlier today with the graduate students about sort of the terror of reading somebody whose work is like approximate to yours, and I can still remember when I was in graduate school and Marjorie's study of Yeats came out, and I read it and I thought, we don't need another book about anyone in the 20th century because this is so amazing. I can really, I'm not even joking, I can remember the step I was sitting in the University of Chicago, right outside of the business school staircase, because I was like, this book is amazing. So thank you to Marjorie for decades of just mind-blowingly amazing scholarship, and also obviously to my two companions here. It's just a very exciting time and a very exciting group of people to be working with. So this book, Modernism in Irish Women's Contemporary Writing, started as much of my scholarship does with a fight. That I had been trained in modernist studies. That was my background in graduate school, and that was what I focused on in my teaching and scholarship. And when I finished my first book on Irish drama, I was sort of poking around looking for a new project, and it was kind of the dawn of an Irish modernism, right? It was when we were still kind of developing a vocabulary and an understanding of what made Irish modernism distinctive. And I went to an early conference on this in 2007, and no one was talking about ladybooks, right? It was just the same. It was just all for reasons that are incredible. I mean, no one's going to deny that Joyce is amazing, right? So there were all kinds of papers that were on male authors, and there was the occasional paper on Elizabeth Bowen, but there were no other voices that were a part of it. And I remember asking one of the keynote speakers, who shall go unnamed, why do you think this is? And I was scolded and told that there was no such thing as an Irish modernist woman writer. And I had read enough to know that was not correct. And so that became sort of the creed core of this project, right? Is why is there no more recognition for the figures that were writing during the period of Irish modernism, right? The traditional period, right, from the, I would say 1890s, right, to roughly, we say 1992, the publication date of Ulysses, or if we go all the way to the beginning of World War I. I mean, the dates are kind of mobile, right, but that kind of early 20th century high modernist moment, we weren't able to talk about it. And so I started thinking about that and reading around, and it was really, one, impossible to get anyone interested in that, right, presses, but we're not interested, right? And two, I think it was really when I saw writers, and women writers in particular in the 21st century, starting to recapitulate all of the familiar things that we think of literary high modernism in the 21st century. And I was like, ha-ha, And so formal fragmentation, stream of consciousness, syntactical play, I mean, all of the things that we associate with pastiche, with high modernism, including the themes and even the authors and architects of the movement, were appearing in books like Emma McBride's Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, right? Were appearing in books like Anna Burns's Milkman. And so when I started seeing that, the question became why, right? It's not even that they were necessarily pushing high modernist tactics in new directions. It was the same kind of high modernism that you would get off of Wikipedia. It was highly recognizable. So that, I think, became a prompt for the larger questions of this study, right? What is the use of a movement that everyone regards as sort of familiar, old-fashioned, expired, right? Why use it past its sell date? And so, and is there a particularly kind of Irish answer to that? So that's where this came from. In order to do that, I had to expand the periodicity of high modernism, right? And to think about, sorry, not of high modernism, but of the contemporary, right? If we start the contemporary in 1939, we carry it to the future. Why do we see the kind of similar iterations of modernism in all of this fiction? And that's where the term mode came from, and stubborn as well, right? That a mode, as Jameson and others have described it, is a set of recognizable features that move across periods and genres. So why was this one so stubbornly present in women's writing? And in a nutshell, I basically argue that it's because they're trying to ask us to pay attention to stubborn problems, right? If these modernist, highly recognizable modernist tactics are still in play in the 21st century, that suggests that a lot of the problems that were identified and examined by high modernist writers are still alive and kicking in the 21st century. So the kind of obduracy of those formal, thematic, and historical referential aspects of high modernism are simply a reminder that things like, oh, I don't know, political fascism may still be alive a century or so later. Just saying, So it's a kind of relentless reminder of that. It gave me an opportunity to examine writers who are just fantastic, and that are highly canonical. Edna O'Brien, I think we can agree, is probably the most canonical of 20th century Irish women writers at this point. And Sally Rooney, probably arguably the most popular, if not most canonical, at this point of 21st century writers. But also writers that are less well recognized, particularly by readerships outside of Ireland, like Maeve Kelly or Deirdre Madden. So just trying to understand that. And then again, one more thing is a focus on interiority. Right, if you're part of a culture in which female interiority is verboten, right, that you are supposed to be cosseted in the home, hidden in the church, that your interior life is supposed to be focused on your family and on the kind of practical aspects of everyday life, what did it mean that all of these writers were insistently exploring the contours of female subjectivity through these kind of sinuous or fractured forms? What do we learn from that? Does that...
Great. So it starts with a fight. I remember your narration of that fight later.
You do.
As you worked on the book, how did your thinking develop? How did your thinking about the subject change? And in particular, maybe, I'm very interested in how you hit upon the chapter divisions and the titles for them looking refashioning, praying, daydreaming, logging off. I think it's great.
Yeah.
And it's very original, and so I'm very interested to hear A, how you developed into that, and B, kind of what you think it enables those chapters to do.
Yeah, so I think each of the chapters is focused on a kind of exercise of women turning inside, right? So that praying had been understood as a kind of public and collective act, right, until around the 19th century, when it was suddenly understood as a kind of private and kind of internalized and imaginative act, right, in which you're sort of having a silent conversation with an intercessor. And so I was curious about that turn, which Charles Taylor identifies, and thinking about how Catholicism worked for women. And it let me do some early work that I had done on Kate O'Brien, right? When I finished the first book, I just sort of read my way through Kate O'Brien because I love The Land of Spices. I think it's such an amazing novel because it shows us sort of how Catholicism is good for women, and it also shows us at the same time how Catholicism is bad for women, right? And she asks readers to hold both of those things in her head through the entire novel. So I've always been riveted by that novel and how she was able to do that with her kind of dual stories, of this middle-aged, Mother Superior and a young girl kind of coming of age in the Catholic tradition. So praying is everywhere. I mean, I'd like to say, I so cleverly identified these different categories, but in fact, they're everywhere. It's I'm a big reader. No secret. I'm a big reader. And every time I was reading these things, these same kind of patterns would show up. You would always have characters who were daydreaming. You would always have characters who were praying. You would always have characters who were, in the 21st century, sort of logging off, as we all become these digital subjects and we're constantly on with the pings and the kind of calls to our attention. I was interested how 21st century writers suddenly could regard female privacy not as something that was going to have you incarcerated, right, in a mother and baby home or in a Magdalene laundry or even in the domestic space of your own cottage, but instead, could privacy in the 21st century with the freedoms that were newly available to Irish women finally become a good thing, right? And what would that look like? So I think the thing that I discovered, partially just from kind of exploring representations of consciousness in that first chapter on recalibrating, how they went back and used all these familiar tactics to think about female consciousness, allowed me to recognize the dramatic change in attitudes towards privacy over the course of that century.
That's great. And I really love the way it enables you to draw connections among a group of texts as opposed to it's chapter 3, so I'm talking about Kate O'Brien. I think that's a really helpful thing. I'd now like to start inviting Kate and Claire to just say some things about your response to the book.
Well, thanks first of all also for having us here. It's super exciting to be here as an alumna of BC, but also to celebrate a book that when I finished reading it, I texted Paige and I said it's magisterial. And I do mean that. I mean, it's lucidly written, it's cohesive, and I think one of the most important sentences in the book, it's on page 17, is when she says, effectively, if you leave women out, if you leave half of the modernist writers out, then you miss half of modernism. So I think one of the most important contributions of this collection is the fact that it's not like what I cheekily like to call the field day effect, where you're kind of tacking on because you omitted women. This is something where she's revisiting the canon, and she's creating space for what was always already there. So I think we all owe her a great debt of gratitude for the work that she's done and for how important that is and will be going forward. So I would just start with that.
Thank you, Paige. Thank you so much. I just want to echo what Kate just said, and thank you, Marjorie, for having us all, and congratulations to Paige on a wonderful book. Yeah, I mean, there's a few things. I just love the doing of the book. Like we have chapters, in each chapter there's an action, right? There's praying, there's refashioning, there's daydreaming, there's logging off. And I think, the interest in interiority and a kind of refashioning of privacy as a concept is really kind of animated and energized with the doing, so that the interiority and the space of privacy becomes an activist force, right, that Paige charts. And I think that's just theoretically such a unique framing of it, and I think it resituates and reorganizes the relationship of the private and the public. And I love the phrase, the styles of publicness, that you use, and the ways in which the women writers you're looking at really push against those styles. You've created space for everyone here, right? And we thank you for that. I also what I also love, and it picks up on what Kate was talking about the making of space. What's so important about this book, I think, is the structural organization of each chapter, where it's not a chronological study, right? So we don't have that generational model, which of course has its advantages, but the dangers of it is loss, right? That we move, that's what happens to women's writing, is that it gets forgotten, it gets lost. And Paige's structure here is to place women in different time periods in conversation with each other in different thematic organizations. And I think that's a structural intervention in cycles of forgetting that happens to women's writing in Ireland, and it really makes new space, right? I think that's so important. It makes new space for us to think about what the paradigms of how we read, think, curate, and you're interested in curation as well. So and craft arguments about women's writing. So thank you.
Just going off of what Claire just said, I want to add one more thing, and that's the remarkable emphasis and the completely well interwoven emphasis on teaching. One of the things that all of us in the humanities are unfortunately familiar with these days is the tendency to denigrate what we do, to say it doesn't have any real world contribution. And I think this book very much naturally works against that argument by showing how thinking deeply, reading deeply has real life consequences for us as individuals, for them as characters, but again, particularly for us as individuals. And this is the kind of seamless conversation that I think literary scholars should be having, right? There's a tendency among some in the humanities to think that it cheapens what we do, to think about the real world impact, but that's actually not the case. I think what we do is critically important, it's necessary, it's good for society, and the origins of universities were to be a public good, and the humanities are at the forefront of that, so I really appreciated that aspect too.
Can I just say one more thing? I'm just about doing again, because Kate's talking about doing. So this is just so exciting. I love this. What I love about this book is that modernism becomes something that we do, right? It is not something a writer is or is not, right? It's a practice. And the stubborn mode is such a wonderful, willful way to resist what you chart in the book, which is the stubborn, kind of intractable phallocentrism of the Irish literary canon. And so there's that stubbornness that pushes against that stubbornness to overcome, and I think that's so brilliant. There's so many more things, and I'm forgetting all the things I want to say. But
we could do this all night.
Yeah, we could just pass back and forth. But it's it's just brilliant.
This is great. I have almost no work to do at all. I'm going to take what Kate said about teaching as my chance to ask all three of you to say something about your experiences teaching Irish women writers. Were there challenges or obstacles that you encountered? What the students seem to respond to most strongly? Do you have a favorite text that you like to teach in such a class?
Yeah, so I'll start. So I actually came to Irish literature through the job that I have, right? That I didn't actually train in Irish studies, and in fact, I didn't know a great deal about Irish literature when I got the job through sort of the vagaries of the market in 2000. And so I basically had to teach myself as I taught classes with students, and it was a trial by fire, and it was amazing, right? I mean, because it was already always in conversation with others about the value of these works, as I myself was encountering them in the body of scholarship that surrounded them. So we were learning together, and it was really, really gratifying. What was striking to me from the get-go, as I was teaching courses called Irish Contemporary Writing or Irish Women Writers, was that students didn't necessarily understand who counted and who didn't, right? You would teach an array of writers, some of whom would be canonical and some of whom would be folks they'd never heard of, and students would respond to the book because they didn't come with an instantiated understanding of this matters because it's Joyce, this matters because it's Flann O'Brien, this doesn't matter because it's Kate O'Brien, this doesn't matter because it's Deirdre Madden, right? That they didn't come in with that, and they could respond in a kind of pure way to what was in the words on the page. And that was an enormously instructive lesson for me. You know, the sense that you have to meet the text on its own terms, and then once you do that, you can start to kind of unfold the kind of critical context that surround it, the way that it speaks to the contemporary moment, or the way that it spoke to its historical moment, the way that it speaks to animality or trans interests, or all of the things that we were talking about today with the graduate students that are the kind of critical pursuits and the theoretical pursuits that undergird their explorations. But I do think it's important to know that these books have weight and merit on their own terms, and there was something really valuable about teaching and being forced to kind of have to be on top of these things, right? One of the things I'm proudest of in this book are the close readings. I love close reading. It is my jam. And I work on that with students in the classroom because I want them to have that skill of slow, attentive reading. We live in a world of kind of clickbait and Wikipedia summaries, and now the devil that is, AI, generative AI. So how do you teach students to understand and to do the kind of labor, which is sometimes kind of boring and difficult, right? And to see the rewards of that kind of attention. And I think that these books invite that. And I don't have a favorite. Although I do love teaching Milkman. But I love teaching everything, so that's not even a fair answer.
I haven't taught Milkman yet. So I guess I would say two things to that. The first is it was striking to me in teaching. I teach from 19th to yesterday, literature basically. How little context the students had to approach an Irish text, and we'll probably wind up talking about this later, I'd imagine. Therefore, the importance of giving them sort of a social, cultural, political context so that they can feel confident to navigate these texts. So that was interesting to me to see what was visible, what was taken for granted, what wasn't, and I think there are real lessons in that as well. The second thing is I teach a 19th century English and Irish women writers class, probably every 2-3 years, and consistently I can't get the women's novels. So I remember being in grad school and copying a book, basically a whole book, because it was the only way that I could get it to teach it. And I thought those days would be past, but I couldn't get The Land of Spices last year. I couldn't get The Real Charlotte. And these are canonical Irish women writers' books, or, let me say more correctly, these are canonical Irish books. But it's the fact that I couldn't get them for this class. I would not have that problem with someone like Joyce. So I think there's an ongoing concern, which is present too in this book, about not just where we situate women in the canon, but there's a real tactical, practical question about why some of these books are still not being published when we, the academics, all recognize that these are crucial works to the canon. So I think that was a real surprise to me. And in terms of favorites, I mean, yeah, I like them all too. Although it's always surprising which ones teach better. Like sometimes you think some things, you're like, oh, I really got them this time. They're gonna love this book. And then they frown at you and you're like, really? So like, it's unpredictable sometimes, but that's part of the fun because it is a two-way interaction. And I think every time I teach something, I learn from my students as well. And that's part of the privilege and the fun of what we do.
And yeah, I mean, just to echo what Kate just said about the text and access, and that was something that came up today at lunch, and the problems with access to certain texts by women writers, and it just keeps happening over and over again, which is a real problem. My experience of teaching Irish women's writing here in the US has been, again, just in terms of setting the context, in terms of understanding what the Mother Ireland figure means and has meant and what it means as a trope, and the whole history of the gendering of Ireland, both in imperialist discourse and in various nationalist discourses as well. So one of the things I find really helpful is I always start with The Wild Irish Girl, and I think that really, it's just an amazing book in and of itself, but it also really helps when we get to the more contemporary text, understand the ways in which gender is constructed and the ways in which women writers push back against it. But the other text that's really helpful is Dorothy McCardle's The Portrait of Roisin Dhu, which is a short story and just wonderfully encapsulates the ways in which the ways in which the gendering of Ireland as a woman, what it takes from the actuality of lived women's experience. And then also Kathleen Houlihan, Gregory and Yeats's play, which is another great illustration. So I think though, I always teach those texts, and then I think they, like I said, they really help us understand the country girls, understand what O'Brien is doing with the country girls, as well as, of course, the more contemporary texts. Favourite ones, I always, Enright, always, I think. The Green Road, I think works very well in the classroom. But I have to say, teaching contemporary Irish women's poetry is a real favourite. And I think really, students really respond to that. And I think, again, somebody like Yvonne Boland and also Paula Meehan really allow for us to understand the tropes, the gendering tropes of Ireland, which still kind of insist and adhere, right, in different ways right up to the present day. So you see women writers continuously grappling with it. We were just talking about It Goes to the Throat upstairs there for a while. And you can see that how it's threaded through that whole book. So yeah, but it's a great course to teach, and I feel I really love it. So
I'll pick up on the access problem question and maybe ask the three of you to just reflect a little bit on the situation of a kind of global literary marketplace in which very important works keep disappearing because they go out of print, and a few writers, like me, Sally Rooney, and I was also thinking of Claire Keegan, become these mega stars, and I'm kind of left wondering why this is.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't have a very interesting answer because I think it's just misogyny. I mean, it always is, right? That's okay. not specific, it's just the truth. It's a stubborn problem. Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's very striking to consider why this keeps happening over and over, right? So one of the things, I had to write an article for a collection on Irish women's writing a few years ago, and they asked me to write on turn-of-the-century Irish women's novels. And, you know, Vera's book was kind of the book out there for the longest time, right, that actually took on the Irish novel. And it was astonishing to me when I went back and looked at how many Irish women's novels there were from this period, by W.H. Letts, by Rosa Mulholland, by Catherine Kynan, like hundreds of these novels, and no one was talking about them. You know, and it was striking on two counts. One, because we had so many in the library at the College of the Holy Cross, right? So these turn-of-the-century novels, when you had these oftentimes Irish immigrant priests teaching students who had an Irish-American background at this, you know, privileged all-male liberal arts college taught by Jesuits, they were turning to popular fiction by women writers in order to understand what was going on at home. You know, so there was a kind of focus on the everyday, there was a kind of focus on the quotidian in these novels. They oftentimes had kind of predictable narratives, but they were redolent with details that allowed American readers to understand life in Ireland, and not just American, but all the diasporic communities, right, that from the forced immigration in Ireland. And no one was talking about these books, right? So Sean O'Whalan, I give this quote in the book because I was so shocked by it. In 1984, Sean O'Whalan wrote, I think he was just being deliberately cranky, but there's an aspect of truth to this, that there was no such genre as the Irish novel. You know, and of course there was, but they were written largely by women. And so the idea that these, you know, are rotting on shelves unattended to, and a lot of them are terrible. I'm not gonna say, oh, these are amazing, we have to, you know, a lot of them are terrible, but a lot of all kinds of traditions are terrible, right? You have to sort through to get the good ones. And they're really telling and provocative accounts of a particular historical moment. And they were all bestsellers. You know, I mean, these women were paying the bills through these books. So the fact that they are lost is not a problem that people didn't love them, that people weren't buying them, that they're not in collections, which is why I say the answer always has to be misogyny, right? That there's no particular kind of reward for studying these, reprinting them, teaching them. And that's really been exacerbated for me by the work I've been doing on Irish romance fiction, right? So I write a difficult book on difficult problems, on difficult prose, and then I turn around and my next project is romance fiction, because it has a happy ending, right? And it's easy and accessible. But it's also another genre of fiction written by women for women readers that has been abused. You know, everybody looks at genre fiction like crime fiction or horror fiction or science fiction, and we're like, I can take that seriously. But you talk about romance, and suddenly everybody's hiding the cover of their book. It's just, you know, and it's keeping the lights on in publishing, right? It's the best-selling genre. And again, it's written by women, just like this whole realist tradition. You know, I've said this elsewhere. Ulysses did not come out of nowhere, right? We think of Ulysses as the Irish modernist novel, and it is. I'm not going to argue. My favorite novel. My career, Irish women writers, my favorite novel, Ulysses. That's how predictable I am, right? But at the same time, that book comes out of a tradition of Irish women's writing about the quotidian, you know, and we have to be able to acknowledge that and talk about it, and we have to be able to read it. And that, again, requires a kind of activist energy and a kind of stubbornness on the part of critics, right? Because presses are not running to publish that stuff, right? Journals are not running to publish that stuff. They're like, Rosa Mulholland who? So you have to find a way to really force those things through.
I mean, the irony is, you know, to Paige's point and to her book's point, this is not a new problem, right? The devaluation of women's literature. I mean, we could go back to Jane Austen and Northanger Abbey when she writes an impassioned plea for respecting novels, and she names Edgeworth and Burney and other contemporary Irish and English women authors. So it is a question of the canon, and like nationalism, the problem with the canon is it's always already predicated on what you leave out, right? And so I think some of it's a question of canonicity. Some of it is that question of devaluing women. I mean, Marjorie mentioned earlier that she encouraged me to do a collection on an Irish woman author named Nora Holt. Since we're talking about Sean O'Whalan, one of the things he said was Nora Holt is the best living writer right now. And that was, what, 1929, I think? Yeah, so has anyone heard of Nora Holt? Probably not too many,
My
right?
class has.
Yeah, so there you go. So, I mean, I think it is a question of what we value, and I think there's an implicit assumption that if it's in the canon, it's male. And it's the outliers that tend to change that pattern, and that's one of the reasons why I think this book is so important.
Yeah, I think it's about rethinking space, right? Rethinking what the room looks like. And if you don't mind, I just want to read a quote from Anne Enright about this, because I think she describes it really well. She says, this is in an essay she wrote, Call Yourself George, Gender Representation in the Irish Literary Landscape. She says, so this is about contemporary women's writing, and, you know, to Marjorie, your point about Sally Rooney and Claire Keegan maybe having kind of being constructed by a kind of patriarchal representational economy as the kind of exceptional women, right? And how within those kind of patriarchal structures, there's room for one or two, right? And that's a personal thing to do with Sally Rooney or Claire Keegan, right? That's the ways in which they're kind of inculcated into that system. But anyway, Enright says, in the last 6 years, there's been a stream of notable debuts by Irish women to complement the stream of notable debuts by Irish men. These women aren't shy and unassuming, unless they are, nor are they screaming through the air, lunatic, unless they want to be. They are publishing in a time of cultural change and into a new awareness, one that is fed by social media, acknowledged in print, supported by publishers, and encouraged by festival curators. At least I hope they are. I hope we will finally sit side by side in the newspapers, on the stage, up on the damn poster, men and women together. There is plenty of room. And I just think that idea of the room, right, and there being room, is so important when we're thinking about this, because if we do look at the landscape at the moment, there are a lot of women writers, and they're getting published, and you know, and it's there, it's all there. Like, you look at Rooney and Keegan, and they're part of a constellation, to draw on Sinead Gleason's book, of amazing women writers, and they're all there together in the room. And so I think rethinking what the room looks like in kind of non-hierarchical ways, exactly what Paige's book has done, recreating that space. If you think about Field Day 4 and 5, again, it was this massive enterprise with multiple editors. If you think about what Tramp Press are doing, right, they're recovering women writers as well as publishing contemporary women writers. So it's like reorganizing what this room looks like. And I think that's the labor, and it's on multiple levels, right? And as teachers, as scholars, as publishers, as series editors, like Kate is thankfully, you know, the Irish editor for the Irish Studies series line at Syracuse University Press, right? And creating those spaces so that we have a different structural place and a different room, really.
Can we talk a little more about how the whole kind of literary landscape coming out of Ireland has changed in the last, dare I say it, 10 or 20 years, which I think we all can remember. You were ending on a kind of happier note, Claire.
Yeah.
How does that landscape look different than it did when we all first started doing our work? And where do we think it's going? What are the particular themes, issues, and so on that are being paid attention to now, but that also, what's tomorrow?
Well, I will tell an anecdote that I often tell when I'm discussing this book with people that has to do with when I first started working in the archives in Ireland in 2000. And I would stumble from the National Library over to Hodges Vegas to look for some contemporary fiction to read, just what had been published recently. And I wanted it to be by women, right? Because I was primarily looking at male playwrights in the book. And so I would look for contemporary Irish women's fiction. I would go in, and there would be one, maybe two books. And I would buy them, only one or two, and they would both be amazing, right? So there are two problems, right? One, there are only one or two books, and two, the gatekeeping required, right, for those two books to be breathtaking is I think, telling, right? And I say now when I go to Hodges Vegas, right, I walk in and there are a bajillion new books by Irish women, and a lot of them are mediocre and even terrible, and I think that's fantastic, right? So the landscape has has really changed, right? As a result of sort of arts funding, as a result of, and also I think as a result of popularity of Sally Rooney. I mean, this book would not have gotten published were it not for the international celebrity of Sally Rooney. I had been shilling this book for a decade, and people were like, "Oh, that's really great." No, no, nobody's going to read that. Nobody in China wants to read that book. Was something someone literally said to me, a publisher. And I was like, okay, I disagree. But when Sally Rooney came out, suddenly there was a thirst and a hunger for this. So the marketing and the international popularity of these two Irish women writers, while a problem, is also a wonderful thing, right? As always happens. And that's allowed a lot of voices to come out. And I think one of the reasons that I have hope for this, I mean, there's probably going to be a backlash, because there always is, right? Suddenly, like, oh, what happened to the men is going to be a big question, and then we'll have that moment as we're having right now socially. But that sort of sense of what social media can do when it's good. I mean, like, I believe social media is the devil's work, and you can quote me on that. But it has allowed women writers to actually articulate their own voice, right? Their own projects, to market, to advocate, to call attention to the work that they're doing. And I think like Nisha Dolan right now, right, being on the flotilla to Gaza, that she has been able, as an amazing writer of fiction, love her work, to sort of to do her activist work, to do it in the Irish language, and she's doing the Instagram reels, right? So that she's reaching a global audience that may or may not be readers, and may or may not be readers of Irish literature, and may or may not be readers of Irish women's literature. And yet suddenly that kind of high profile point of access, I think, invites attention to her work, which is utterly riveting. So I think that there are ways in which this kind of moment of flourishing, which is creepily like the early 20th century moment of flourishing of Irish women's writing that no one knows about. I'm hoping this one has more traction.
So I'm going to read a sentence again from Paige's book. This is on page 100. I forgot my glasses, so I hope I get it right. Rejuvenated by Irish women writers, such familiar experiments demonstrate the possibilities that derive from imaginatively reviewing and potentially recalibrating obdurate problems under new historical conditions. And I think in addition to whatever it is that has allowed more of those voices to come out, I think the historical conditions are different. So for example, if you were to talk, and I know I said this earlier, if some of you have read The Land of Spices or you read The Country Girls, those are texts that engage mostly marginally with the problems that we now know, thank you Jim, as the architecture of containment. A lot of novels today, like Small Things Like These, Full of the Stars, will take that as a background in its entirety, but the exposure is not the question of the novel. That's just a context that's used for the insights into character or questions into interiority. And I want to make sure to re-presence another thing that I think Paige is heavily engaged with here that leads to questions about imagination. What is the role of imagination in contemporary Irish women's fiction? I think it's huge. So when Paige talks about reverie as a space for imagining, I think you can see that also, for example, in As You Were by Elaine Feeney, who I'm currently obsessed with. And she uses technology in that way. She says basically technology enables her characters to imagine something that's not actually real in the moment, but it could be, or it was an alternate possibility. So I think considering the ways that interiority and shifting cultural contexts and the role of imagination are in conversation right now is fruitful.
That's, just to kind of what Kate was saying there about interiority and Elaine Feeney and technology. I also think Paige's analysis in her book of what she calls a kind of knotty interiority of subjectivity is really interesting, and I think you see it across contemporary women's fiction. And I'm thinking of Louise O'Neill's work and also Malatu Ucha-Corey's work in terms of how virtual worlds become interior knotty spaces, not necessarily of a kind of alienated or isolated subjectivity, but of one where the interiority of selfhood is deeply connected with others, and that's both has challenges and it can be very alienating in and of itself, as well as being in other forms productive. So I think that there's within more recent fiction, contemporary fiction especially, there is this ability to imagine this kind of state of being connected and being always connected in ways that are both productive. And we tend to think of relationality in productive ways, but I think if we think about the ways in which we are always connected virtually and technologically, and how reductive that can also be. So I think that naughty interiority is really useful.
Yeah, and I also want to underscore the question or the issue of pleasure, right? I mean, we're used to thinking of these novels. I think this gets to your point about sort of the background of institutional and historical sort of repressive structures that women and men have had to deal with in Ireland. And one of the things that I'm super interested in right now in contemporary fiction by men and women is the representation of pleasure, in particular sexual pleasure, right? Like, what does it mean in Ireland to represent an intimacy when you're coming out of a culture where that kind of physicalized or emotional connection was often perilously dangerous and sometimes even fatal, right? Like, how do you make sense of consent and condom usage and asking for what you want or need, right, in an intimate relationship when you're in a culture that also produced the girl's a half-formed thing, right? So I think what's been exciting to me about the surfeit of women's fiction that's come out in the past, 10 to 20 years has been a kind of opening up of issues, right? That you don't have to keep telling the same tragic story. I mean, I think I even mentioned this in the book. Like, I feel like in every single thing, like almost every book that I write about, like, there's going to be somebody drowning, right? Somebody's going to drown because things are that bad. And I say that flippantly, but I do think it's a register of the difficulty of talking about the end of kind of fulfillment and positivity and connection and overcoming resilience, right? And so I think there's been a kind of caution about the representation of pleasure, and I think that's something that we're starting to see more of in fiction, particularly by women, in ways that I think is exciting.
That gives me a chance to ask you all a question about Irishness, about the Irishness of Irish women writers in the 20th and 21st centuries, how much it matters, how they seem to be responding to the idea of Irishness. How relevant is their Irishness these days when Sally Rooney has gone global, or is it a matter of reception that they're read differently in Ireland and other places? How do you think about the category of the national?
I'm starting all in. I feel like I keep starting.
You go ahead.
So I think I thought a few years ago that some of the questions of Irishness would be less still present than they are, and I was not correct in that assumption, at least in the text that I read. But I think the way it's being used is constitutively different. And so partly to piggyback off what Paige was saying, I think there's more of a focus over against those wider historical contexts, which again are obdurate problems, as Paige has signaled, not to let that be solely deciding in terms of the character's fate, but also I think there's been a real zeroing in on embodiment, questions of the body, of subjecthood, which again I think is very different than what we've seen before. So I think it's a both and to me. Like on the one hand, you still have, and I'll mention here another Elaine Feeney. I told you I'm a little obsessed right now. She just published a book called Let Me Go Mad in My Own Way. And toward the very, very end of that text, she has a sentence that says, the domestic is also political. And I thought that was really, really interesting because it kind of flips the priority of the political impacts the domestic to say that there's something political about the domestic as well. And I really kind of was struck by that inversion. So I think it's still there. It still matters. Sometimes I'm surprised by how much some of that matters, but I think the representation of character and the relation of character to context is very, very different.
Yeah, I think Kate, that's a really good point about the shifts. One of the things I've noticed is, and one of the things I'm particularly interested in, is this questions of like decolonial solidarity. And in kind of more recent poetry by women, I'm thinking of Nithi Casa, Fairly Speaks, and also Anne-Marie Nikuranen. Their work there's a lot of interest in their work in like kind of the images of the root, a kind of rhizomatic roots that bring us into a kind of, I suppose, a decolonial past that reinvigorates for a kind of diverse imagining of nationhood in contemporary Ireland, and drawing on folklore, drawing on histories that move from Ireland to Nigeria to the Congo, and allow for the decolonial solidarities that you see also in something like Dairy Girls. Particularly that scene on the first episode of Dairy Girls. And I suppose in some ways what that first episode is showing is the failure of decolonial solidarity in ironic ways. But so I think that that the nation, kind of conceptions of the nation, are being harnessed in particularly in contemporary poetry in really interesting ways that move us beyond the nation, right, to other nations in kind of a transnationalism, but that's very politically charged. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's interesting as I'm thinking about this question, right, is the way in which Ireland is both familiar but just unfamiliar enough, right, to sort of ask us to look differently at whatever's being represented. So I'm thinking of the kind of circuit of Trinity novels that have kind of come in concordance, but also in the wake of Sally Rooney's novels, right? This idea of what does it mean to focus on a particular university, right? And and the experiences of affluent white characters as they sort of circulated this affluent white school, and I think there is something really important, and of course, the modernist in me is like, it's sort of Joyce's celebration of the quotidian, right? That that this is a kind of cultural habit for Irish writers, and the kind of grounding of these contemporary narratives in a kind of Irish revivalist, Irish writing by Irish writers for Irish audiences about Irish subjects, right? That these are kind of, I would argue, literary cultural hangovers almost. But I am really struck by the refusal of characters to let go of the explicit Irishness of it. That there's obviously going to be the kind of subtext that all of us who study Irish literature can identify in any of these works. But I think it matters that most of these writers are still insistent on the characters, coming out. I'm thinking, for instance, of Sola Emanuel's Wild Geese. Has anybody read that? Write it down and read that book. Sola Emanuel's Wild Geese. So that's a novel about a young trans woman, right, who's on Erasmus, gone to study at a Northern European university. And it's formally experimental, and it's a fascinating account of her attempt to, she's coming out of a culture where abortion is legal, she's coming out of where the identity of trans persons is recognized by the Gender Recognition Act, she's coming out of a culture where there's same-sex marriage and the kind of destigmatization, not completely, right, but largely or significantly, let's say, of queer identity. And that novel, I think, so beautifully kind of captures the way that the habits of thinking, Irish habits of thinking, travel with you regardless of how much you change your positionality or your gender or even what you're studying, right? Because she's studying, I think, the circulation of water in sub-Saharan Africa, if I remember, right? So there are all of these kind of registers in the characterization of her that code as global, or at least EU, right? Like, oh, this is an EU Ireland, but it's still so obdurately Irish. So I do think that that's kind of an interesting and perhaps unanswerable question about sort of the traction of that, because it is, I think, a very useful way of asking us as readers who are not Irish to sort of examine currents of thinking in our own culture. My students find this really fruitful. If we're talking about, I don't know, say reproductive rights or Catholicism or rural identity, right? That it always looks both similar to and different from what we know in America in a way that I think is productively unsettling.
I'm going to start moving now to being open to questions from the audience. I will, while you all think, I will ask another question. Jim Smith's class was kind enough to send me some questions. And you just mentioned the rural. One student brought up the question of representations of the natural world. And it seemed like an obvious question to ask if these women writers think about the natural world and climate and talk about a stubborn problem.
Do you want to go first on that one?
I'm rotating, but I don't want to give you a question where you're like, yeah, I don't answer that one.
No, actually,
She does. She has to say.
yeah, well, I'm thinking of Keelan Hughes's The Alternatives, and Paige talks a lot about time in her book, but kind of geological time, deep time, and kind of the ways in which, and I mean, I think you see it in Anne Enright's The Wren as well, particularly close to the end of the novel, and how I think again it brings us back to this question of activism and women's writing and the kind of the intimacies that you see in Ireland between women's writing and activisms, and it's no, you mentioned the flotilla and Nisha Dolan and also Sarah Clancy, and so and the connections with women's writing in Ireland and activism and thinking about the way this naturalism and the landscape that is so familiar, right, to Irish writing and to a tradition of Irish writing, and how we see these how we see contemporary writers really disrupting that kind of that stabilization of landscape. But I think Keelan Hughes is just super. She's just fantastic on it.
I mean, I think in terms of the landscape, my first thought would be Sarah Baum and Still Simmer Falter Wither. Most of the readings of that text have focused on her use of the land and the way that that's employed. But I'll mention, because I know there was a grad student who's working in this area, that's also a really good novel for animal studies. So there are really interesting ways that so many of the novels written by women authors right now are crossing multiple different interpretive frames in ways that are empowering and refreshing and really exciting to read. I mean, you could read one novel and think there are 5 different arguments someone could make about this because of the complexity and interest. So.
Yeah, I think there are 2 things. One, and I'm gonna get the numbers wrong because it's a big joke in my family and among my friends how I can never get a date or a number correct. But I wanted to point out that there was a recent study that came out, and you can look this up on I think it was in the Guardian. It was also in the Irish Times. But apparently, the average, like all households, and this is gonna be close but wrong. I know, I wish I had a memory. I'd be such a better person for it. But all Irish households use, I think, 18% of the energy in Ireland, and I think data centers, which are running AI right now, use 26%. Were these the numbers that people read that? So all of the households in the country are using 18%, and these generative AI machine data centers are using 26%, and that's only going to get worse, right? So this question of globalization and climate, of affluence, right, of Ireland's place on the world stage, particularly as the EU continues to kind of take a step back in political machinations. We're seeing, these affiliations, with Trump world right now that are changing kind of the role of Europe. It's going to be really interesting to me to see what happens as Europe and even Ireland, right, has to start putting money up for their military, right? When and things like that. What kind of choices are they going to be able to make? Because these kind of investments are coming belatedly. Because you want to think they're going to make different decisions because they know better, but we haven't always seen that with issues of, say, race, in Ireland. So I'm not really sure we're going to see them with climate. And so I think it's a really potentially exciting and potentially horrible moment, right? To be thinking about what it means to be, distinctively Irish while you're thinking about the climate. Particularly because that's what the tourist sport traffic's in, right? It's like the Atlantic way, So, to put up and shut up when these kind of figures and facts start changing because of a changing global geopolitical power dynamic is going to be depressing.
Audience questions. Joanna.
Thank you so much for this panel. I think one thing that it's really illustrated is how Irish women's writing and writing on Irish women's writing is really engaged with this stubborn activist energy and this interest in wrestling with and challenging and subverting and working against right problems. And one thing I guess I'm really curious about or thinking about as a result of this is what is particular to work on Irish women's writing, both like within it as like a body of work, but also like critical work that's engaging with it that could be educational to both other fields and other communities. I'm thinking specifically about like trans studies as a field right now and kind of as a young field, but I could see this also being beneficial to like other areas of academics, but also critical activist and artistic work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a long tradition of activism in Ireland working, right? I mean, this is kind of the fun of having, you know, as my husband keeps joking, he's like, can you not just sit in a period or with a genre? And I'm like, nope, you know, I'm like, no, I'm gonna do drama. But if you look at the early 20th century, right, and the kind of activist energies that undergirded the Irish cultural revival, right, that worked. You had all of these students who were playwrights and poets and dancers and graphic designers and publishers and, you know, young people who came together to create Irish art, to make the Irish feel prouder of their identity and therefore willing to fight for independence. And guess what? It worked, right? I mean, yes, we all know the Easter Rising was chaos, but at the end of the day, that process worked. So there's a kind of, I think, optimism that you have in Ireland about the capacity of the arts and the individuals who make art to productively change the world. You know, like watching Sarah Clancy yesterday, her response was, you know what, I couldn't stay home and do nothing. You know, and I was like, I know lots of people who can stay home and do nothing, you know, in America right now. You know, how many No King's Marches can you go to? You know, and how empowered do you feel by that? But there is, I think, a sense of empowerment in Ireland because it worked before and it can work again. You know, and so I think that would be the message I would take. You know, I actually teach a course called Irish Literary Activism, and I've taught it for years. And my students are blown away when you're just like, read this, and then this happened. Read this, and then that happened. You know, like, you know, this is how women got a right to a legal abortion in Ireland, and it came from collections. It also came from pop-up stores, right? So it wasn't just kind of literary, you know? It wasn't just the Repeal the Eighth collection. It wasn't just people reading stories and writing stories. It wasn't Anne Enright or Sally Rooney writing pieces about abortion, right? Those things mattered, but they all came together and they helped to get people back home to vote in the referendum. You know, so there's a whole history of successful activism, and if you see things work, it makes you feel good. I mean, I think like so many of us feel defeated right now because you're like, I'm donating to PBS and I'm marching and I'm, you know, like I'm doing all the things I think should make a difference and they don't, you know, because we're big and we're baggy. But I think it's different. There is, I think, a kind of encoded optimism, which is really exciting for me as a scholar, you know, to see, because it reminds me that it's out there.
Yeah, what she said. No, I guess I would just say, I agree that literature seems to have just a different place in Irish society. And I was thinking about the fact that, so again, to go back to Nora Holt, who everyone should read, I think one of her short stories in the collection Poor Women is actually a direct response to James Joyce's Eveline. But what's interesting, it's called Miss Jocelyn, what's interesting about the short story is that it's from the position of an older woman, whereas Eveline has a choice to make, am I going to leave, am I not? Miss Jocelyn has no choice because she's run out of money, because she's single and she's older and no one will hire her. And so this is like a real concrete social commentary that happened intertextually. So I think it's important not to undervalue, not that any of us is, but it's important to remember the power of textual conversations, and that when you hear those conversations, they themselves are a kind of act, to go back to something Claire said earlier, right? And while I'm mentioning that, I'll just put in a plug that EPISIS, which is the European Association something for Irish Studies, I should know this, it's embarrassing, I forget what the acronym means, but it's the European equivalent of the HCIS. They're doing a roundtable next week on celibacy in Irish women's writing, and that goes right to questions of ageism, pressure to marry. There are so many issues that could fall under that umbrella, and again, it starts a conversation, and that conversation, for example, about ageism, that's a political act, right? When we question what it means to have mandatory heterosexuality, or when we question what it means to expect someone to get married, that you're either pre-married or married, and there's no space in between. And those of you who just read The Land of Spices will remember that false dichotomy. It was actually 3 options, but the priest presents it to the character as, you will either decide to become a nun, or you may decide that you don't want to live always alone, as if you get a job, that's your fate. And he's like, and then you may marry. So the third choice of being an independent woman with a job is presented as this horrifying non-option. So that's a long-winded way of saying, I think the intertextual conversations and the conversation those in turn lead to can themselves be a political and activist act.
And it's such a wonderful question, and I've been thinking about it as Paige and Kate have responded so wonderfully. I think with the questions around reproductive justice are so important at the moment here in the US, and with abortion, what's happening with abortion rights here. And I think the history of reproductive justice in Ireland, the history of reproductive rights, the what happens in the 1980s with the Eighth Amendment, and of course the recent repeal, but it stretches right back, and when you think about what gynecologists were doing, in the 40s, in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s, it's really interesting actually to go back and look at the kind of the studies written by gynecologists in Ireland and how they were, performing abortions, right? And so I think, and again, I'm a long-winded way of saying that I think on this particular issue, looking at the ways in which writers in Ireland, both contemporary writers but also writers, in the earlier parts of the 20th century are kind of representing in some ways kind of sideways or certainly obliquely issues to do with reproductive health. I think is really, really useful kind of use, I suppose, of Irish literature and Irish just kind of Irish history, with that particular focus on gynecology and women's health, I find it very useful. So thank you for a great question.
Other questions? Yes.
This is mostly directly about praying, but also relates to the point that you just brought up, Kate. I loved it and had the chance to just read it alongside Blend of Spices a few weeks ago. Thank you, Jim. And I was hoping you could expand a bit on how this subversion of the prayer mode is not only critical of Catholicism, but also examines its success in emboldening women. You and O'Brien both seem to explore the religious order as a means of autonomy for women outside patriarchal marriage economy. And I'll tack on, since you mentioned it earlier, does this come at the expense of pleasure, Ben?
Well, I might actually just jump ahead to Hood, right, which is also in that chapter to talk about that. I mean, you can talk about it with Land of Spices, but I think the Hood example is kind of a better one. So that's Emma Donohue's novel. I'm sure many of you know it. I know Jim used to teach it. Are you still teaching that? Yeah. So this is a novel that's organized in the kind of week by week. Lots of Irish novels, right, go day by day, right? Even Wild Geese, which I mentioned earlier, 7 days, follows that kind of diaryistic quality of it. Okay, so what I love about Hood, which is a kind of account of this woman's subjectivity as she's mourning her dead lover, is there's a kind of marvelous moment. I talk about this in the book, right? Of what's made possible by prayer, right? I think about this a lot in terms of kind of the secularization of American culture, right? Because I grew up in Alabama, right, in the 80s, and we went to church every Sunday, no matter what. Not Catholic, but Episcopalian, but that's where I learned how to be bored. That's where I learned how to use my beautiful songs. You have to stand up and I was working through stuff because I was trapped in this room for like an hour and a half, right? Sort of looking. And I think one of the things that we have lost, although I'm sure much has been gained by secularization, if I'm allowed to say that at Jesuit school, is that sort of training in how to be bored and how to use your imagination. And I think that also comes at a cost of pleasure, right? Because when you're in church, or at least in the Catholic tradition and the Episcopal tradition, right, it's filled with beautiful song and nice smells and pretty silver things and gorgeous stained windows and sonorous prayers and the kind of rhythm of that, the beauty of that language. And so I think that there's something about your imagination being cosseted in that beauty, right? That routine, that ritual, that creates a kind of safe space for whatever your imagination is learning how to do, particularly as a child and an adolescent. And that's one of the things I love about Hood is I think that O'Donohue is one of the few people I've seen who can identify that and who can sort of show us, because I mean she's thinking dirty thoughts about her lover, right, in that scene, and that becomes a kind of sacred act, right, that moment of kind of connection and intimacy with her partner. And I was talking about this earlier. That's one of my favorite moments in Sally Rooney's Beautiful World, Where Are You? And again, I never remember the name of these characters, but Simon and Eileen. So Simon and Eileen hook up, right? And then the next day, Simon wants to go to church and Eileen goes along with him. And I love that moment, because I was saying this earlier, so you have to bear with me again. But this idea of Rooney trying to grapple with what is lost when the entire Catholic institution falls apart because of the exposure to clerical abuse scandals and the industrial schools and the mother baby homes and the Magdalene laundries and all of the other travesties, right? And she's watching Simon, so Eileen's watching Simon, able to access, right, the pleasure, the psychic, the faith, the sensory pleasures of that kind of communion with his God. And she's sort of outside of it and both entranced by it and baffled by it. So I think that what's interesting to me in that chapter, right, is a culture that so radically went from, like the highest attendance in mass, of any country in Europe or the West, right, to suddenly everyone revoking it in one generation. I tell a story all the time, and many in this room will know Margaret Kelleher. And when I go to visit her when her father was alive, her father would come to visit her, and he would go to mass in the morning and come home and do his crossword puzzle, and then he would go to the carvery, and then he would go to mass again. And it was just his routine with his tweed cap and his blackthorn stick, and then here's Margaret doing her job and marching and and the kind of radical difference in their relationship to church going and praying in one generation. And I'm not telling secrets, she would tell this story herself, because that's across the board, at least with my friends in Ireland. And that's a dramatic schism. Like I feel like in at least in my tradition coming out of the American South, there was a kind of slow winnowing away of church going, and it was like this in Ireland, right? So there's both going to be a kind of get that away from me because of these abuses, but there's also going to be, I think, a profound nostalgia for the more positive aspects of Catholicism. And again, I say this, I'm not Catholic, I've been teaching at Catholic school for 25 years, right? Everything I know about Catholicism, I learned from books. And yet, I can sort of see, right, from the commitment to social justice, right, the commitment to the notion that there's something bigger than ourselves, right, the commitment to the notion that if you are a good person, you get a present at the end. I love that. Who wouldn't love that? So what happens when we get rid of that or when that's totally contaminated? And I think that's another thing, in addition to sex, of course, because it's always sex and religion, but like, in addition to the kind of questions of like pleasure and intimacy, that is another really interesting question to me. What fills that hole? Because one can only shop on Amazon and watch Netflix shows for so many hours, right? So what are you going to do with that extra time? And that's a question for you.
Well, what I do, I think that answered it. Well, did I turn this off? I did.
Do you guys both want to speak to it?
I don't think we need to. I think you
No.
covered it.
Okay, other questions?
Shelby, want to say something?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's good.
Go ahead, Shelby.
You talked about like a stubborn problems and a stubborn mode, but you also said something about stubbornness as a sort of like critical attitude or like a productive stance for the critic. I was wondering if you could say more about that and what it looks like.
Yeah, because you gotta say it 50 times, right? I mean, like, publish my book about women writers, publish my book about women writers, publish my book about women writers. You need to publish my book. Please will you publish my book? Publish my book about women writers. I said that for a decade, right? And guess what? Somebody finally published my book about Irish women writers. So this idea of, to make change is difficult. It requires resilience. It requires the capacity to be told no. You're dumb. You're lazy. You're not pretty. You don't know what you're talking about. I mean, like, you are going to get slagged if you're trying to make significant cultural change. And I say this as a privileged subject, right? Like, middle-aged, educated, American, middle class, upper middle class, white woman. I got no problems, right? And yet I do, right? And to change those problems, I think about my child in public school, right? Having to advocate for him, he has ADHD. I love the beauty of publicness now, where you're just like, I just put everything out there because everybody needs to have this normalized, right? I spent so much time advocating for that kid. He had to advocate for himself. His teachers advocated him. His guidance counselor advocated for him. I advocated for him. His dad advocated for him. His executive functioning coach advocated, just to say, get an extra 15 minutes on his SAT. All of these systems are there to make things more difficult for you so that you will, again, order things on Amazon or watch Netflix instead of trying to change the system. Everything is organized to keep things the way that they are for people who have power and money. So the stubbornness and refusal to let go of things that matter is the whole point of the exercise. And it can be something as kind of picayune as like, I think these women writers are really important. You need to pay attention to them. Or it can be save the planet, But you've got to do it over and over and over, and you cannot take no for an answer. Sorry, I got a little carried away there.
Did you want to say something?
No, I love that. I just think, I think what you just said is brilliant. And I am thinking of what the constant repeated performance, the necessary repeated performance of it. And what Judith Butler says about, how realities are made, right, through the repeated performance of acts. And what I really appreciate about Paige's book is that you kind of match stubbornness with stubbornness, right? I mean, the literary system that you're pushing against is stubborn, right, in its refusal to make space. And I think by kind of using the terms against, its own terms in some ways against it, and in a radical move to actually create a much more equitable and non-hierarchical space is incredible talent and gives us kind of structural models of how to do this. I'm thinking of Rosie Braidotti's work on how she uses kind of rhizomatic, nomadic models of subjectivity to challenge the rhizomes of late capitalism, right? And so I think that that paradigm is so modeled so wonderfully in your book.
I'm going to break my rule now and say something following on those two things. I also think that a certain stubbornness and patience are what we model or should model when we teach. So it's not just a matter of you should pay attention to these writers, but here's how I'm approaching a project, a problem, an analysis, a reading. I think it's a very important part of our teaching.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Claire said that it made me think, and we talked about this a little earlier, the three of us, about Sarah Ahmed in Living a Feminist Life. And one thing she does in that text is she uses only women and minoritized scholars. And I've talked to who shall remain nameless male scholars who are really affronted by this. And it's sort of like, well, why? Why is it a bad thing? I mean, it happened for generations that only the men were sort of in the room where it happens. No, I'm not going to sing, don't worry. So that was a thing. So what's wrong with reframing as an experiment to show you could? Not to say that that should be the new normal, but to show that you could. And what does that say about the voices that we don't bring to the table?
Other questions? Yes, Catherine.
Thank you very much. This was a great discussion, and congratulations, Paige. My question is one that's very conscious about the changes that have come to Northern Ireland over the last 2.5 decades. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about similarities or differences between women who are living and working in the Republic as opposed to those who have emerged over the last 2 decades or so in Northern Ireland. Are there commonalities? Are there differences in how they approach what they're writing?
Yeah, so I would say a person who's really good on this is the writer Lucy Caldwell, actually. She's phenomenal in talking about sort of the ways in which the border is porous, and really attending to the commonalities between writers in the North and South. What I will say is striking to me as somebody who is moving from, say, The Gathering and Cedric Grenard and moving into Milkman is my students, my poor students, it's been a rough start, a rough first midterm for them. I'm just like, and here's another deeply distressing book about sexual abuse. And here's another deeply distressing book about sexual abuse. Oh, and here's a stillbirth, right? I mean, it's brutal, right? When you're looking at sort of contemporary writing, 21st century writing that's recounting sort of the experience of women, particularly in the South. And so when we're getting ready to move into Milkman, and I was just like, okay, so we're still going to have sexual harassment and abuse, but we're also going to have political violence, So I do think that there's something distinctively different, obviously, about the legacy of the Troubles. It's kind of a boneheaded answer, but I think, what you see is, at least in my experience, particularly the stuff that I look at in this, formally, there's actually not that much difference, I would say. To read a Jan Carson story is not going to be different from, say, reading, a short story by, why can I suddenly not think of any contemporary short story writers in the South? But the kind of the formal exercise there, or the concerns with sort of contemporary issues, is not different. But they are shaped distinctively by the legacy of the violence of the Troubles versus the violence of kind of like institutionalized abuse. That those noisy things give different contours to that, which I think is an incredibly obvious answer, but I think it's just kind of incredibly obvious. Would you guys agree or disagree?
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Look at that.
I get my question was kind of similar, and so I kind of want to probe you a little bit further on that. Just I feel like the generation before us who dealt with the Troubles like firsthand, there's an awful lot of trauma there, and then there's kind of that ceasefire generation, and the trauma, the secondhand trauma that lives there, and I've kind of been waiting to kind of see that in a lot of novels, and I haven't yet, and so I wondered that you're obviously the perfect panel to ask, because I am not anywhere near as well read as any of you ever, even close. So is there anything out there that I'm from Northern Ireland, and I identify with all of the Irish texts, and I love it, but I haven't really felt that Northern Irish connection anywhere yet.
I got a book for you, and it's written by a guy. So it's Michael McGee's Close to Home. Have you read that? Okay, Michael McGee's Close to Home. Write that down. So this is a novel, I think it was published a couple of years ago. So McGee has a character, a young man in Belfast. So it's a post-trouble, like post-reconciliation novel. And this guy's gone to Liverpool to study and sort of worked on a novel there. He's in creative writing, and he comes home. And it's fascinating to me because the novel, like many things, actually an article coming out about this, but the novel is really good about sort of showing the kind of obduracy of cultural scripts. Right, so here's this kid who's just like, the Troubles at ceasefire, I studied in Liverpool, and I've come home to Belfast, and he can't break the cycles of behavior, right? Like he's violent, but it's like kind of misdirected fights at a bar, right? And he gets arrested for it, but he just has to do kind of like social service work with other criminals, the minor petty criminals. And what's remarkable about it, he can't get a relationship off the ground. And of course, I'm not gonna spoil it for you. But what I love about that novel is it's one of a number of recent novels by both Northern Irish and Irish writers that looks at what happens when in the 21st century you're suddenly starting to relinquish the really powerful scripts that determine behavior, right? If you don't have Catholicism saying this is what masculinity looks like and this is what femininity looks like, right? If you don't have nationalism saying this is what masculinity looks like, this is what femininity looks like. If you don't have those clear codes of conduct and belief in behavior, who are you, right? So it's a kind of great novel where this guy is just walking around bumping in the walls and kind of not doing anything effectively. There's old trauma, of course, but like there's no super dramatic contemporary trauma for him, but he still can't get a hold on how to be a man in contemporary, like, of the moment Belfast. It's super cool. That's just one example. Do you have?
Oh well, I guess it's obviously the male perspective, and it's super important. It definitely is super important in Northern Ireland, especially right now. But the female voice is less of that. I think when it's applied to Northern Ireland, it's almost like this sense of belonging or not belonging, because there's the are you Irish, or are you or are you neither, or there's that conversation in it, and so it's the feeling of belonging. And so listening to you guys talk about space in a literary sense, that kind of applies to the geographical sense as well, and so that's kind of what I think my little person is looking for in a book, and not that I'm making, begging for book recommendations, it's just
Well, but I do think what is remarkable about post-Troubles is the way in which female experience is centered. Like, that was not the case, right? Greer was the work in any genre. I think Anne Devlin's drama and maybe some of the stuff in Carbonk, like there were a few examples of kind of centering female experience during Troubles Era Ireland. And I feel like right now across genres in Northern Ireland, you're seeing female, like Milkman won the Booker, so this sort of idea of the kind of validation of that representation, I think is important.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about Milkman. And I'm not sure if anyone's seen the film Hush a Baby. Or it's really hard to get now, which is it's a wonderful film, and it's a beautiful film. But I think in that film, there's the ways in which Harkin configures the ways in which women in Northern Ireland during the Troubles were kind of absented from the central narrative, right? And obviously what her film does is centre that and around questions of reproduction and women's bodies. And so, when I watched the Kneecap, which, as a film is very interesting formally, but I felt it slid backwards. It was in many ways what Harkin's film was critiquing, got rehearsed in a kind of post-ceasefire text, and I was very troubled by that. And so I think the ways in which those tropes, the kind of, I suppose the woman as land in many ways, and a woman as kind of an objectified space, specifically in Kneecap, and how easily, even in this kind of post-troubled era, how easily they get reanimated. And so I was very troubled about that. And I'm totally blanking on the name of an amazing collection that Sinead Gleeson edited on Northern Irish women's. Yeah, it's amazing. Anyway, I'm sorry I've forgotten the name, but I'll look it up on my phone once we finish. But there's a really interesting, actually talking about Lucy Caldwell's story in that about around abortion rights. And so Mayday, that's it. Mayday is the story, and it's absolutely superb. And I think superb in the ways in which it kind of connects different places, right, on the island around kind of questions of women's bodies. But then, as Paige was saying, the very particular and regional context of the North. But I think the Kneecap film was just very troubling to me, and I think, it just shows, we've got Milkman on the one hand, and then we have this other massive text, and then you've got something like Derry Girls, right, which again is a kind of recentering of women's experience and girls' experience specifically. So yeah.
One more question back there.
Yeah, thanks. This is really beautiful. I just wanted to know, through your research, how I love the idea of contemporary modernism, and I wonder how all of your research in that has made you rethink or think differently about the period of high modernism, or going back to the interwar period. So how has this research maybe changed how you read, or what have you learned when you go back to Elizabeth Bowen or something like that? How has this informed that?
Yeah, I think for me what it did was kind of underscore the artificiality of a kind of male modernism, right? High modernism, the MSA didn't award a Best Book Award to a female scholar for I think the first 16 years of its existence. So that kind of male-focused modernism has repercussions, right, that continue almost into the present day. And again, I got that number wrong because I'm going to get every number wrong today, so you're going to have to look it up, but I'm close. So I think, seeing the various mechanisms that precluded women from being included in the modernist canon, the definitions of a modernism that strictly comes out of, say, T.S. Eliot's definition of a modernism that we've held on to, I think makes me look at other traditions. But other things that it did, it also made me realize that Virginia Woolf is just kind of the best. For this project, I literally went back and read every single thing that Virginia Woolf has ever written that's been published, right? And, there's how her mind could do what it did. So it was an interesting dance between, well, of course, Virginia Woolf gets to be a modernist because she's like 1,000 times better than anybody else ever at what she does, and that lets her be, But there's a space for mediocre modernism, and the idea that women still can't even get invited to that party, I think was really, really striking to me. That it's just very narrow.
Well, now, please help me thank these three fabulous scholars.
I want to thank you guys because awarding time and attention to these issues is how we change things. And so for you to plug out a part of your day, and also to Boston College Irish Studies, I just celebrated 25 years of the College of the Holy Cross, which makes me want to punch myself in the face. I can't believe I've been there that long. How time flies. But from the very start of my career, this place has been enormously supportive, and some of my deepest and richest friendships have come out of this place and what it's enabled. So it's a delight to be here with old and familiar faces, not old faces, old familiar faces, because they're part of this longer narrative, but also all of the new people that have gotten to meet today. So thank you all.